I'm going to talk about the social and cultural impact of the internet using Britain as a case study here. Just to start out, let me tell you a little bit about myself so you know where I'm coming from. I'm a sociologist by background and training. I've been studying computers and the internet since the 1980s. I think of myself as a classic sociologist, which is, I study classic sociology, which is inequality, specifically digital inequality on the internet. Inequality, as you'll see, is a very big tent, and I'm actually only going to talk about a fairly small part of it this evening. But it does mean that I have papers on all kinds of things, from different ways to use the internet, how online skills are acquired, Alexa-style smart speakers, dating apps, the politics of echo chambers, and a variety of other topics. I'm going to be using this evening primarily a study called the Oxford Internet Survey, and I'll be highlighting some of the major findings from that survey. So with that as an introduction, I'm going to talk about 5 trends here, starting out with there's been continuing steady diffusion of the internet among the British population. We're seeing increases stabilizing in a number of areas in some population groups. For example, among the young and the wealthy, 100% of those groups have been using the internet essentially for the last 10 years. But there are much lower percentages use the internet for some other groups that I'll get to. Now, while the percentage of internet users as a whole seems to be stabilizing, users themselves are increasing the intensity of their use. So we're seeing rising intensity. There is a rise in a group of users we will call next generation users. These are people who use the internet intensively, and particularly they use the mobile internet. We are seeing a continuing rise in the use of social media. Despite these changes, we're seeing persisting digital divides in a number of areas. Some of this exclusion is based on resource constraints, like lack of income or living on a fixed income as a retired person. But a more important part of exclusion is exclusion by choice. People who feel there isn't anything there for them, or the internet has nothing interesting. And these apply to both users of the internet in general and to social media users of the internet. So to start out with, just let me summarize the Oxford Internet Surveys. We have 16 years of data. These data are random samples that are generalizable to the British population as a whole. They're from England, Scotland, and Wales. It does not include Northern Ireland. About 2,000 cases a year. There are waves starting in 2003, and the last wave is 2019. If anyone's interested in why we haven't done it since then, ask me in the Q&A, because it's sort of an interesting story. Let's see. The interviews are adults aged 18 and over using face-to-face interviews in respondents' homes. They're about 45 minutes long, which is a very long interview. We collect data on hundreds of variables. So it's a big, complex survey. I'm going to omit a lot. If you're curious about something that I don't mention, ask me, and I probably have some data on it. The strengths of Oxus are, in particular, that it's very high-quality data. The in-home interviews are extremely important to this. We get a very high response rate by the current standards of survey research, about 51% in 2019. And we have a true random sample. In the past, Ofcom has used it to benchmark their surveys. We also have a consistent survey from 2003 forward, so we can measure trends and change over time. So this ability to compare is extremely important, as you'll see. Now, one of the original goals of Oxus was to be comprehensive, but that's long ago proven to be impossible. As a result, we still have hundreds of questions on dozens of topics, things like government website use, experience on the internet, trust, attitudes toward technology, privacy, uses of the internet like political participation, communication, internet news gathering, and many others. It is the best quality, most comprehensive internet data in the world. So with that as an introduction, I'm going to talk about some very broad parameters of internet use. This is internet use from 2003 to 2019. You see the vertical axis here is percent of the population using the internet. The horizontal axis is years. And you'll notice that we have three lines which represent three groups of people. The top line in dark blue are the internet users. And in the course of 16 years, you can see internet use has risen from about 59% to about 82% of the British population, a 23-point increase in 16 years. There's a corresponding decline in non-users being this light blue line here in the center. And this is one area where I suspect we're seeing the end of growth for a very interesting reason. Ofcom conducts a yearly adult media literacy survey where they ask a similar question about internet use. And since 2015, their internet use numbers from 2015 to 2019, they were getting internet use numbers in the mid-80s, about what we see here. After the pandemic, this number rose to 93% of the population. Now, that change could be due to the pandemic, but I think it's more likely that it's a methodological artifact due to changes in the questionnaire, because there were two shifts. The least important shift was the shift from a face-to-face interview to a phone poll and a web survey. The more important thing was shifting from asking whether the respondent used the internet to asking whether the household had access to the internet. And that, of course, would inflate the percentage of users. So I personally suspect that 85%, about plus or minus, is a better estimate than 93%. And I suspect it's unlikely to change. The reason is that about 15% of the British population is not functionally literate. And without functional literacy, it's very hard to use the internet. So you'll find it hard to learn to use the internet. You'll find it hard to use the internet. Your use, if you use the internet, will be relatively limited. And this problem is not just an issue in Britain. I suspect it's a hard limit everywhere in the world. Functional literacy is going to be the key limiting factor in internet use going forward. And this is something that the government policy people do not want to hear, because they can invest a lot of money in bringing broadband and fiber access to everyone. It just costs money. But reforming the school system to produce fewer functional illiterates, that's hard. And nobody really knows how to do that. There is a book by Paul Willis called Learning to Labor, How Working Class Kids Get Working Class Jobs, that speaks directly to this. There is an anti-school culture among some groups in the population. Now, the third group of people is this line down at the very bottom. These are ex-users. These are people who once had regular access to the internet, who no longer do. It seems to be stable at around 5%, perhaps declining a little bit more recently. And for these people, in many cases, the internet is a choice, and they've chosen not to use the internet. So this is another major issue on use of the internet, when we have a group of people who simply say, I don't want to use it. Now, this is the broad picture you see here. And I'm going to look at more specific drivers of internet use and non-use. So where are the continuing internet divides, and what are the characteristics of people who use the internet or who don't use it? We're going to begin here with age. Now, again, we've got percentage of internet use in the vertical axis and age groups across the horizontal axis here. Now, the first law of the internet is everything everywhere is related to age. You see the negative slope here. It's a fairly steep slope, which indicates pretty sharp stratification by age. The general pattern is that older people here are much less likely to use the internet. And we see that pattern in every wave. The lightest line here is the 2005 data. The darkest line is the 2019 data. And in fact, if you compare 2013 and 2019, you'll see among the young age groups, there's very little change here. In fact, if you take people under the age of 50 and run a regression line through that, you'll find that the slope coefficient in that regression line is not significantly different from zero. So broadly speaking, under 50 years of age, pretty much everyone's on the internet. But at 50 years of age, there's a very sharp inflection point where the internet use starts to drop off very quickly. And this pattern actually has been quite consistent across the early waves of the internet up to the current wave. This is income by internet use. You can see we've got 5 categories of income here. There's a great deal of change in the early years here, the light blue lines. The dark blue lines show relatively little change in the later years, particularly from 2013 and 2019 here. But there is sharp stratification by income. In fact, if you look at this graph closely, in 2009, 95% of the wealthiest age group already used the internet. Even now, if you look at the other end, only 62% of the people with incomes less than £12,500 a year use the internet. So there's very sharp stratification by wealth. This is internet use by life stage. We're using 3 life stages here. Students are the dark bars. Employed people are the middle bars, and retired are the lightest bars. You can see students basically are essentially at 100% internet use and probably have been since 2003. There is a rising use across the employed people here as they go up to 96% in the 2019 data. The retired people lag considerably in terms of internet use. This is internet use by educational qualifications. We've got 4 educational qualification categories. The lighter colored bar is people who say they have no qualifications. The darkest bar is people who have a higher education degree. In higher education, we're seeing relatively little change between 2013 and 2019. People with a degree are basically at 95%, and that hasn't changed very much. The biggest gap here is the gap between people who have no qualifications and people who have any qualifications at all, even basic qualifications, you can see. What's happening in part is many of these people with no qualifications are older. As the population overall is becoming more educated, and so internet use is growing as these 3 upper categories are growing in proportion of the population. Now, you can ask the key stratification variables that any sociologist will talk to you about are age, income, and education. And lots of things in Britain, and for that matter, in all industrial countries, are split by those 3 categories. So you could reasonably ask which one is most important here. Now, you need a multivariate analysis, of course, to do that. I'm not showing the results here, but if you do that, predicting internet use or non-use, in other words, the dependent variable is a binary variable and you're doing a logistic regression, age is the key variable. That accounts for well over half of the variation in use or non-use. A couple of other things here are important. One is to look at gender. In the early years of the internet, the gender gap was a big issue. But by 2009, the gender gap has disappeared into the sampling error of the survey. Essentially, there's no difference between men and women from 2009 forward in use of the internet in general. There remains a gender divide in a number of areas in the internet. Instagram use in Britain, for example, is 70% female. Dating site use is 60% male. So you can find gender gaps if you dig down into the data further. I should say, since I'm talking about margin of error, the overall survey has a margin of error of plus or minus about 2.5 percentage points. Of course, these individual categories will have larger margins of error because they have smaller n's in them. Finally, we look at disability here. There is clearly continued stratification by disability. The dark bars are people who are not disabled. You can see the steady increase in internet use among the non-disabled, as well as steady increase in use among the disabled, but the disabled are only sitting at about 59%, even in 2019. So disability matters a lot. This is an interesting event because one might argue, and in fact people have before they see data, that disabled people are more likely to use the internet because the internet gives them a whole set of capabilities that might be hard for them to gain in the physical world. They could reach out and communicate with people without having to leave their homes or offices. It would give them, screen readers can make up for the fact that people can't see very well. There are a variety of other accommodations you can make. And so one might argue that disabled people should be using the internet more. That's clearly not true in the data. Okay, so let me summarize the broadly stratification in the internet. Internet use is stabilizing somewhere in the mid 80% in the British population. And that has not changed at least since 2015, possibly because of limits to functional literacy. We continue to see digital divides by age, income, education, life stage, and disability. Interestingly, we see no difference by gender. So with that, I'm going to talk about the uses and effects of the internet. And I'm going to talk about that in 4 categories. First, I'm going to talk about the benefits of the internet and who realizes the benefits of the internet. Then I'll talk about the contribution of the internet to economic mobility, entertainment and leisure, and finally, government services. So, to begin with, it's not enough to be an internet user. It also matters how effectively you're able to take advantage of the use of the internet. So, are you actually, in other words, able to benefit from using the internet? And the benefits, this is benefits by education. In the 2019 wave, you can see we've got 4 different benefits here. Found information that improved your health, saved money, found out about an event, and found a job. And we've got the 4 education categories you saw before here, where a higher education degree is the darkest category. But the pattern that you see here is that the higher educated people are better able to use the internet. They are more likely to realize the benefits of the internet, even to the point here of being more likely to have used the internet to finding a job on the internet. Now, one would think this would, again, not be the correct pattern because these people here who have no qualifications or basic qualifications are presumably getting less skilled jobs. And almost all of those are online now. And in fact, I think it would be very hard to apply for a job, a less skilled job, unless you applied online. So it's very curious that this number here is not higher. These people are clearly missing out on some of the possible benefits of the internet. So that's one issue, is internet use by education. Here is the contribution to economic mobility. Now, we've got three different categories of questions about whether someone will help whether the internet will help you improve yourself economically by taking an online course or online training, finding information for a new job, or finding a job itself. Now, this one you saw before in the previous slide. The other two are new, and these data are time series. So the darkest bar is the 2019 data. The lightest bar is 2005. And you can see the pattern here is a steady increase in the percentage of people who find information for a new job or who find a job over the internet. This is ambiguous because the online course and online training item was changed in 2019. The wording was changed at the request of the funder. And so it's hard to feel like this is it's not clear that that's a real difference. In terms of entertainment and leisure, again, we're looking across multiple years here. It's very interesting because different leisure activities have different patterns. If you look starting on the left, looking at photos, looking at music, and watching movies and videos seem to be increasing quite sharply. Particularly watching videos and movies is increasing sharply. Downloading music seems to be stable, as interestingly, playing games is also quite stable. If you look at gambling over the internet seems to be increasing, although not nearly as dramatically as videos or photos. Looking at pornography seems to be stable. So we've got a fairly small but perhaps significant impact here in looking at pornography. We look at online government services. The dark blue line here is uses of government services. And you can see here, we've got a pretty steady increase of 39% in 2005 to 75% in 2019. But consider that the government has had for at least 6 or 7 years a digital by default policy where it tries to push people to use the internet rather than do anything by phone or in person. This increase of only 36 percentage points in 14 years is not very much. People have not been terribly cooperative with the government's policy here. It would be my conclusion. This is use of government services in detail, starting out with finding information on central government services, paying a central government tax or TV license, information about local council, information about a government policy such as transportation, paying a local county tax or fine, and information about an MP. And here again, we see a fairly steady rise in use of the internet all across various government services. So to summarize the effects and uses of the internet, better educated users tend to benefit more from the internet. The internet is increasingly important for economic mobility. The government, of course, is trying to promote this by putting large amounts of money into fiber and broadband. The internet is especially important for entertainment, especially for video and movie use, but also for photos and music. And we're seeing some stability in some of the entertainment uses, particularly online gaming and porn. And finally, we're seeing growing use of government services. So we wanted to explore internet use without reference to commercial use or to the use of particular products. Those tend to be a little ephemeral and they change quickly. It's hard to get a stable idea of what's going on. And those are subject also to fashion trends and so on. So we wanted something stable. And what we found was an emerging group of users who were increasingly prominent as intensive internet users. These users share two characteristics. First is they are mobile users of the internet. And second, they access the internet on 3 devices, at least one of which must be mobile. And we're calling these users next generation users. So these are particularly intensive users of the internet who are also mobile users. So how do they connect to internet use? Well, this is that internet use graph that I started out with, but I've added 2 extra lines to it in orange. The dark orange line here is next generation users. And starting in 2007, which is the first year we can calculate those, find these people given the questions we ask in our data, that's risen from 13% to 72% of the British population, whereas first generation users have declined to about 10% of the population. We're seeing people who use the internet become more intense here in their use of the internet through this mechanism of being a next generation user. Now, if we look at entertainment and leisure by next generation users, we've got, I think, 8 different categories here of different kinds of leisure, starting with looking at pictures, listening to music, and ending again with pornography on the far right. We can see next generation users are far more active on the internet than first generation users. They are more active, often by 30 and 40 percentage points more. Just an enormous difference between them and the first generation internet users. So that makes, they're making a very big difference, these people. If we look at their use by entertainment across these 3 years from 2011 to 2019, if you look at this, they're clearly, there is some stable use here. Downloading music is stable, I suspect, because people are using streaming music rather than downloading it. Playing games is stable, as we've seen before. Gambling may be stable, but everything else is increasing here. Listening to music, watching videos, and downloading videos. And watching videos is increasing particularly fast here, which makes a great deal of sense if you're thinking about broadband and use of broadband in Britain. If we look at content production, this is 2019 data again. The dark line, the dark bars are next generation users. And if you look across all of these 6 categories of content production, next generation users do a lot more content. They visit social network sites, post photos, post videos, post creative work, and so on, much, much more. So they're the ones that are really doing the major contributions to the internet. So to summarize, next generation users are well-educated, wealthy people who have resources. They're equally students and unemployed people. They're doing working on the internet on the move and in more settings. They are active content producers of the internet. They regard the internet as essential for entertainment, essential for information, and there's some evidence that increased differences between next generation and first generation users is increasing. Now we turn to social media. Well, social media are one of the surprising success stories of the last 15 or 20 years. They give people very easy ways to communicate, and they no one really anticipated what would happen here. So for many parts of the last 20 years, social media have been the fastest moving, fastest growing, most striking part of the internet. So here, if you look at social media use, and here we're only looking at internet users on this graph, social media use starting in 2007 was about 17% of the British population, rising to 85% in 2019, with probable evidence here that this curve is flattening out, seeming to level off. And in fact, if you look at more recent data since the pandemic from Ofcom seems to show that there's no change in social media use since the pandemic. Here is social media use by age. This pattern is something that'll be familiar to you by now. We know that social media use is most common among the young. And in fact, use among people aged 24 and younger seems to have stabilized at about 95%. There has been some growth in the last couple of years here in the social media use among older age groups. And so after age 65, age 55 and 65, we're seeing some growth between 2013 and 2019. So again, we have a very strong pattern of stratification by age in use of social media that we've seen before. We look at social media use by household income. I think the surprising thing compared to the previous graph of internet use is how flat the social media use graph is. There is a difference between the people at the lowest who have least income and the people who have the most, but the difference is only 8 percentage points, which is considerably less than we saw in that earlier graph. So it's a relatively small gap in what people are in social media use by income. If we look at educational qualifications, educational qualifications seem to show a larger gap here. Again, we have 3 years and the same 4 categories of education you've seen before. We see about 20 percentage points between the lowest group here of people with no qualifications and people with higher education or further education in terms of their social media use. So so we've got we have another set of stratification here where education matters as well. So the question is, what do people do on social media also? Now, if we divide social media activities into social activities and informational activities, where social means things like updating your status or personal information, learning about issues, clicking on links, or posting or commenting on pictures, whereas informational activities are receiving news, learning about issues, commenting on issues. What you see here is social media activity is overwhelmingly dominated by social activities. So you can see 80% of social media users do at least some social activities compared to 44% who do at least some informational activities. So this is one of the big differences between social media and other sort of websites on the internet. Social media really is social in many ways. However, this is one of the complications of recent internet use. We've seen increases in social media sites like Pinterest, TikTok, and Instagram, which are not nearly so oriented toward the social activities as were Facebook or Twitter. And there's other data, and in fact, there was a marvelous article on this in The Economist about a month ago that talked about how most of the groups of people, like family groups who were once on Facebook, have now moved off to private websites like WhatsApp and Telegram, where you can't see their posts anymore. The posts are only visible to members of the particular group. And there's much less individual posting on Facebook than there was 5 years ago. Facebook is much more now it looks much more like YouTube. It's an entertainment source where people watch videos and clips and things like that. So this would be very interesting. News also seems to be declining in more recent data, I don't have the original data for that to show it. So a summary of British social media use is we see stability by some measures of social use. In some uses high enough in some groups that it seems to be stabilizing, for example, among younger people or higher income levels. Social media use is divided by income and education, but especially by age. Users tend to be wealthy, well-educated, and young. Most social media users are interested in socializing. It would be, yeah. So let me summarize here British internet use. We're seeing a continuing digital divide by age, income, education, and disability, although we're seeing signs of stability in the proportion of the population using some areas of the internet. Users are not increasing, but the percentage of users is not increasing, but the people who use the internet are intensifying their use. So they're making much more use of the internet. And this is particularly true among the people we call next generation users. So let me also talk a little bit about the effects of the pandemic here. I don't have direct data on that, so I'm pulling data from multiple sources here, but I don't have the original data from surveys. And it's only now becoming clearer what the effects of the pandemic are, partly because a lot of the data collection efforts had to change their methodology during the pandemic. And so the results are not really comparable, because you don't know whether they're due to an actual change in something or a change in methods. And only now are they getting back to their previous methodologies, 3 or 4 years after the end of the pandemic. So we've seen some areas of growth. Retail purchases online increased rapidly during the pandemic, but in Britain at least, they seem to have returned back to their original trend line. Now, there is something you need to know about retail purchases in Britain. Actually, Britain has the highest proportion of online retail purchases in the developed world. About 40% of retail in Britain is online. Now, we're excluding from that things like auto repair and restaurant meals that can't go online. But if you exclude that, of the remaining part of things that at least potentially could be online, 40% of it is of those retail activities are now online. That compares, for example, to the US, where only about 20% are online. And if you want to know why there are all those boarded up shops on the high streets, this is a very good reason. Video use increased rapidly during the pandemic because people couldn't go out to the cinema, so they organized movie nights at home. That seems to have continued. It's one place that has not returned to its previous trend line. Medical use of the internet rose rapidly during the pandemic. In 2019, only a few private doctors took video appointments, but the entire NHS does it now. And so that's another place where there's been a very sharp step change in the internet. School use of the internet has also increased as a step change at all levels. Although I have to say, from our experience at the Oxford Internet Institute, we've gone back to completely in-person teaching because online teaching was not as effective. Where we had comparable data on student learning outcomes, students learned less when they were taught online. And so we'll probably stay offline. There are some areas of stability. One of the areas of stability seems to be gaming. It hasn't changed very much. It seems to be kind of a niche activity. Games are played by about 250 to 300 million people around the world, which sounds like a big number. And the revenue from that's about 150 billion a year, which is more, for example, than the entire film industry. But 300 million people use Snapchat every single day. And Snapchat is it's an also-ran in social media. 5 billion people have smartphones. There are more smartphones than there are actually adults in the entire world. So games are big, but they're not remotely universal, and they're a lot smaller than what many people think. They get lots of attention, but they're not the center of anything. Now, mobile phone use, finally, seems to have leveled off in the low 90s, with smartphone use leveling off somewhere in the middle or upper 80s. As I said earlier, the number of British internet users is not expanding, but their intensity of use seems to be. So we're seeing a mixed set of trends here. Some existing trends have accelerated, but many did not. And I think that's the story of the pandemic. Thank you for listening, and I'm happy to take questions.
Well, thanks very much. That's a really fascinating presentation.
Yeah.
I'm going to get some more microphones out of here.
Okay,
This
sure.
is the first time we've used these microphones. If you want to come in the middle and take some questions from
Sure.
the floor,
Mhm.
I'll just make sure that we put the other microphones set up.
Yeah, questions from anyone here? Sure.
So lovely talk, and it gave me a lot of perspective on how I like to use the internet, because I'm realizing I don't use the internet like everyone else. But one thing that I thought was kind of curious is you saw a very low percentage of people using social media and things like that for news gathering or information gathering.
Right.
But I use a closed online group of people for socializing, but a large portion of that is information as well, because when we talk to each other, we exchange information on the local news and local stuff going on. And I think personally, if I was presented that question, I might have trouble distinguishing what it means if I was trying to say that I was gathering information versus socializing in the context.
Well, the questions here are separate. So we ask a set of questions on, do you, let's see, the social activities here, it says down, it's in it's all in the footnotes here. The social activities are commenting on status, updating status or personal information, posting pictures. So those are each a separate question. So in your case, if you said, yeah, I comment on, I would update personal information or commenting on my status, but you'd also answer yes to the questions about receiving news or learning about issues on the same thing. So you, in fact, would be doing both in that particular example. Yeah. Yeah. You had a question.
Sorry, the lady here first.
Oh, okay, sure.
Thank you. You briefly mentioned that compared to US, the UK online shopping or internet usage is much higher. How about the other aspect compared to the rest of the globe? Do you have any data? For example, government service.
I don't have any data on that, and I don't know that it even exists for most countries. These data are very unusual. You know, the French collect virtually no data on the internet. The Germans collect some. The US data is mostly from Pew. And if Pew, you know, which is a private foundation, if Pew wasn't around, there'd be very little US data on internet use. So in general, I don't know. The retail number does not depend on surveys, though. And if my recollection is correct, and it may not be, so take this with some skepticism, my memory is that the 20% figure for the US is quite high worldwide, that most countries are less than 20%. So Britain is a real outlier in that sense, as in terms of its retail activity online.
Sorry, another question.
Sure.
Just wondering, recent years, the usage of internet related to information gathering, there's a lot of concern about the fake news. Do you have any data around that?
A little bit of data around whether people are concerned about that. No data directly on anything like proportion of fake news, because this is, you know, these are data on individuals. So we're asking people about, are you concerned about fake news? There are a couple of items on that. There's a lot of concern. I mean, that's a fair statement. Relatively few people, like less than 10%, I think, say I'm not concerned at all. Yeah, right. That's about all I can say about that.
Okay. Thanks very much. So as you've seen, there's a microphone that's going around the room. So there's a little bit of a gap.
Right.
We'll do one more in the room, and then we'll do a few from
Sure.
online.
Well, my question, you invited us at the start to ask you why there hasn't been another survey or group of surveys since
Oh,
20, yeah.
yes. Yeah, this is an interesting story. Basically, what happened is that the British government actually had a committee, mostly academic and some third sector organizations, that was trying to connect the research with British government policy. And this was through DCMS, which was the British government organization that did most of the digital stuff. When Boris Johnson came in, they abolished that committee and pulled all the funding. So we lost our main funding. So we had plans and even had were funded for a 2022 study, but the funding got pulled. So that was Boris Johnson was clearly concerned with getting Brexit done, and nothing else was very important there.
Okay, thanks so much. So Jeff, if you'd like to turn on your microphone and ask a few questions from the online audience.
Yes, we've got a few questions online. The first one came in fairly early on from Pauline from Digital NNS. I'm not familiar with that organisation. Pauline is, perhaps Grant, you could comment. She's saying that government credits, PIP, those sort of things haven't kept in line with the rising cost of the internet. So perhaps I'd add to that. My understanding is there was a scheme where people on low incomes can get cheaper access
Right, and I
to
believe
their
there still
internet
is,
service
yes.
provider. So yeah, I think she's just looking for Pauline is looking for general comments on why the government didn't keep their benefits instead. I appreciate that's a very difficult question to answer.
Right, you're asking
Perhaps
me
you could
to
tell us about the cheap
explain
scheme
the
that I'm aware of.
motivations for the Tory government here. This is something that I'm not going to touch, I think.
Yes, no, I understand that.
The scheme was, if you're on benefits, you would have access to, I don't remember the exact details but it was essentially very inexpensive internet on the order of £10 a month or so.
Yes, I've seen it. It looks quite an attractive.
Yeah, it was a very attractive arrangement. There's some problem with people with equipment not working and things like modem, wireless access points not working and so on, I understand. But by and large, it was an attractive idea. And why it has not kept pace, I have no idea. I mean, Jeremy Hunt's latest budget cut taxes. So
yes,
maybe that's where he found the money.
That's a separate issue.
Yes, it is.
So this cheaper internet, you're aware that it is actually being rolled out?
It is. Oh, it is available. It has not kept pace. It's been available for at least 8 or 10 years, I believe.
Right.
But it's not. But I think she's right that particularly with this last bout of inflation in the last 3 years, I don't believe it's been increased.
It's been particularly painful. Indeed.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Although I do have to say that if you look at why people ask people why you're not online, and you give them a list of 20 or so possible reasons and ask them to check all of them, the most important reasons are always, it's not for me. There's nothing on there for me. I don't want to be online. They're all choice. They're not resource constraints.
It's not resource. Understand.
Now, the exceptions to that, of course, are going to be families with children, where basically 100% of the British schools use the internet in one way or another.
Okay.
So
yeah. I've got a couple more questions. Shall I ask?
Yeah, do 2 more.
Yeah, well, Pauline, again, she asked quite a specific question fairly early on in your talk. The ONS definition of digital inclusion in the last 3 months, wouldn't it have been better to use a different measure, like in the last 3 hours? So you
could. I mean, there's a long debate over this in people who study the internet about what the best way to measure this. For reasons that I don't understand, the ONS has always had their surveys, which are, well done professional surveys. They come up with numbers about 3 to 5 percentage points higher in terms of internet use than anybody else. And I've never heard an explanation for that. ONS doesn't have an explanation for it, but their numbers are high. You know, the question is, what does internet use mean in some realistic sense in terms of an ability to do things like benefit from the internet or to achieve personal goals like, you know, dealing with boredom or loneliness or contact with family and friends or those sorts of things. And my feeling, I mean, personally, I think in the last 3 months is an entirely reasonable alternative. It's not the only one. I mean, in the past year is another typical one
Okay.
that I see in a number of places. There are some countries that use that,
Yeah.
in fact.
Certainly 3 hours seems quite a short.
3
period
hours
of
is a
time.
short window because that's not even a day.
Yeah.
And if you have a job, for example, that doesn't require you to use the internet, you might not have been on
Yeah.
in those 3 hours.
Yes. I mean, her comment is it would be more useful at 3 hours. So I'll just pass that on as part of her.
It would give you a different number,
Number.
and it would tell you more about intensity,
Mhm.
essentially, than
Shall we return to the room? And I've got some more then.
So anybody want to ask a question, raise your hand and the microphone will magically come your way. Whilst we're waiting, I just wondered whether there's any increase in usage of the internet due to smart speakers. I guess the survey not having recently wouldn't have indicated that.
we do ask about Alexa-style smart speakers in the survey. There's no apparent increase. I mean, Alexa and similar speakers have been a serious disappointment to Amazon, and Amazon has recently basically fired most of the people working on Alexa, literally in the past, I think early last fall. So no, people use them basically as glorified clock radios.
Okay.
They don't order the idea was you would order something, you could order things using your smart speaker, and it would be delivered if you had Prime just the next day. So you could order, you know, groceries and clothes and whatever else you wanted. And people don't do that.
Fascinating.
Okay. You know, so the whole thing, Amazon doesn't break out the numbers, but the rumors in the professional press are that they've lost billions of dollars on Alexa because they're selling it basically at hardware cost, but then they're not making any money anywhere else. And there's still the cost of development and so on.
Thank you.
Yes, my question's about the next generation users that you identified, and specifically about the rather dramatic increase in those users and the fall off of what you call the first generation users. I mean, just for clarification, the reason for that has got to be not that the first generation users are dying off, but they're actually transitioning into next generation users. In other words, you're not either one or the other, you're moving from the first generation to the next as an individual. Is that right?
In most cases, yes, absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Just wanted to clarify. Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah, the change is far too swift for people to be dying off. And, you know, there's an odd thing going on anyway. You know, the original assumption in places in the government would be non-users would die off and everyone would be a user. But that's turned out not to be true. I think there's this, and I don't have the graph here with me in these slides, but if you look at the data, there's this inflection point, as I said, about age 50. And this inflection point at age 50 has been there since at least the 2011 data, where you get essentially flat internet use at somewhere close to 100% up to age 50, and then a very rapid decline beyond that. And it hasn't, you know, so clearly these are people who use the internet and are deciding then not to use the internet later on in their life for whatever reason. And you can speculate on what that is, and I don't think anyone has done solid, believable research on why. So
thank you very much for the very informative talk. I'm just wondering if there's a way of corroborating what people are willing to disclose essentially through questionnaires, through, for example, things like Google Trends or, hit, like you say, the sort of retail data comes from another source. So it's a way, yeah, that's basically.
Bits and pieces. I mean, you can't, it's very hard to do internet users versus non-users, or social media users. There have been people who've done lots of tracking studies where you literally attach software to someone's computer and you track what they do on the internet. Those are, of course, highly invasive studies, and it's hard to believe that the people who consent to have themselves tracked are a good random representative sample of the population. So it's hard to know what actually that means. So some things can be corroborated, like social media use, for example. But many things can't be. Anything that's an attitude basically can't be, because that's an internal state inside someone's mind. Yeah. So, question here.
Is there any data on level of trust in terms of how much people trust what's on the internet, or how safe they feel and how that might influence their use?
Yeah, there's a great deal of data on that. That's, of course, a very hot topic right now. Both those issues, both trust and safety. And I've got several papers on that. The trust issue is people tend to trust established media. So in Britain, that means the BBC website, okay? People tend to trust the BBC website. And then you can go down from there, pretty much in the order that you would expect. The bottom is social media in terms of trust. That's the least trusted media. In other countries, it varies a lot. But people do tend to trust what their friends tell them, generally speaking, So I mean, there are not many surprises there in the trust data. Your other point was trust and safety. Yeah, most people feel pretty safe on the internet, even people who've had more than one incident where, their computer has been hacked for one reason or another. Their identity has been stolen, they've received a virus, or those are typical examples that we give people. They tend to feel fairly safe. The people actually, non-users tend to say the internet is less safe than users. Users say it's more safe than non-users do, which is an interesting paradox, although it's a reason to stay off the internet if you think it's unsafe, of course, and that is a reason many people give. There doesn't seem to be, in terms of safety, there doesn't seem to be much stratification. Men and women feel about as equally safe or unsafe. Education levels don't seem to affect safety feelings. Income levels don't seem to affect safety feelings. Safety is an odd thing in that respect.
So can we turn to a few questions online? We will come back to you in a moment.
Okay, we've got Ashok. He's asking, if you take out the elderly people, he's defining that as over 70.
It's been.
I'm speaking as somebody fast approaching. If you take out those people that don't use the internet and severely disabled people, are there other groups that can be classified as non-users, and any other groups? So
other groups other than the severely disabled?
Yeah, so you've clearly identified that there are some
right,
barriers.
There are elderly, and disabled. People who are poor tend not to use the internet. I mean, that's the income part there.
Again, it's an income thing.
Right, Yeah, and those are the three key groups. People with no educational qualifications are another group.
Yes.
That tend to use the internet less.
Any
there are
particular
always people
social groups or
social groups
or interest groups?
Or interest groups.
That's probably where he's attempting.
Yeah, I don't know. You'd have to define an interest group. I'm not aware of any.
You're not aware of any groups?
No, not systematically. I would expect, if you looked at you might find like Orthodox Jews might not use the internet. Certainly
Yes.
in the US, you would find Amish would not use the internet. You know, but those are groups that pretty much uniformly reject all technologies, not just the internet.
Okay. I think that's a good answer to his question. And another one here from Ken. Many thanks for the presentation. Very interesting, informative. Is there any data about internet addiction, please?
There's a great deal of data on internet addiction.
Yeah.
Not so much in this data set.
Right.
But there's a lot of work on that, particularly among young people. And I will say, in fact, I have a paper on this.
Okay. Right.
The main finding of the paper is people who are addicted to the internet tend to be very social people. And sort of the internet is just an extension of their face-to-face interactions.
Yeah.
So they're very interactive anyway, and so they are very interactive on the internet as well. These tend not to be lonely people who have no friends.
Okay, that's interesting.
Yeah, it is. If
That
you're
actually
lonely
changes my
online, you're
perception.
lonely offline, or if you're lonely offline, you're also lonely online, probably.
Okay.
Now, you can find lots of exceptions of that, but in general, yeah, I think that's fair.
Okay. We'll return to the room.
Yes, there was a question about using the internet, people being asked if they'd use the internet to improve their health.
Right.
Now, the question, is there any way to differentiate between people who feel that the internet had improved their health and whether it's actually it genuinely improved their health?
Yeah, whether it genuinely did. Let me find this question. Wait a minute. That was one of the early ones here.
Yes.
We'll run up to it. Benefits. Come on. Yeah. Okay. Right. Here's the question on this right here. Yeah. I don't have any data on that because all I'm asking is, did you find information that what is the phrasing here that helped improve your health? I mean, that's pretty close to the original question. So I don't know. Presumably, you would say at that point, only people who actually felt their health improved based on this information would answer yes to that question.
There is a concern among sort of medical internet people that there's an echo chamber effect in which people can go on the internet and find other people who have non-medical solutions to things, which will tell them, you know, don't trust your GP, do this instead.
Right.
And so they will then feel that because they've found vindication from other groups, they would probably say, yes, it has improved their health. But I just wondered whether it's possible to differentiate that.
Yeah, I think this fits with the general misinformation issues on the internet. Is you can find a group of people, I believe, at least certainly, I've been amazed at the small groups of people that find each other on the internet. And so any particular group of fairly often very small group of people seems to be able to find each other there. And that includes people who have various attitudes toward health information of various kinds. You know, and you know, anti-vax is a big group of that. There are many smaller groups.
Yes. Yeah. Since the people with no qualifications are unusual in that group, in that they are higher in their usage. That question.
Right. Yeah.
Okay, so I think there's another one right at the back of the room. Sorry,
well,
we'll come to you in a moment.
Before then.
Sorry.
So there's somebody before then.
Go ahead.
But we can do both, of course.
Yeah. You've got the mic.
Thank you. Thank you for your talk. I've just read your data. I think it's fantastic, in which illustrates the dramatic transformation of a society, which reminds me of the social contract. It's quite telling because I think it's like that we are submitting ourselves to the internet system in the upcoming generation. And which indicates that we cannot survive out of this context. So I'm wondering if you have a research the side effects of internet, as well as the regulation of the internet, especially in terms of cybersecurity and cyberbullying or something like that. Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, we do. We have questions on cybersecurity. There certainly are a fairly large proportion of the population has had some sort of problem on the internet. Could be a virus or identity theft or financial details stolen or something like that. That does not, by and large, that makes them a little bit more wary, but not a lot. It doesn't seem to turn people off from the internet. But like I said, though, there is this group of non-users who say that the internet is unsafe. And that's a reason why they're not using the internet. Now, cybersecurity, we have no easy way to measure that. I mean, that's a broader issue. It's a systems level issue more than an individual level issue. And these are all individual questions here. So we can tell people, I mean, things like viruses are declining and I think that's mostly because people get antivirus software automatically now with the operating system. And 10 years ago, you had to install it, and a lot of people didn't bother. So.
Okay.
Thank you for your presentation. So my question is about when you say that the limit of internet users is functional literacy, and we all talk about digital literacy. So there are many instances where, for example, before I became British, I was an EU immigrant and I had a digital only status. And everybody now who's coming as an immigrant has a digital only status. But not everybody can use the internet because of obviously digital literacy and potentially other reasons, and that leaves them open to exploitation. So I was just wondering, whether you had a viewpoint, also how that would affect the survey that you're doing. Like, how do we square that circle where the governments push for certain groups or everyone to use the internet for certain things, but not everybody can?
Right.
For various reasons, not just educational, but yeah.
Right. Well, that's the main reason why we do this face-to-face interviews in people's homes, because then we get all the people who don't use the internet and we can talk to them about why. And that's, of course, the big weakness of web polls of any kind, because you can't survey people who aren't on the internet if you're over the internet. So yeah, so we get data on people like that who are not internet users.
Okay, so whilst the microphone makes its way to the front again, would you like to do the last couple of questions from online?
Yeah,
And then I think
we've
we'll call it
got
a day.
another one on from Mike. When you say the inflection point on the internet use is around 50, has that remained consistent, or is it just simply people that are born after a certain year, i.e. 1950?
That number has been consistent since at least 2011.
Okay, so
yeah,
so it does.
it's the slopes change slightly, but the inflection point at around age 50
still the same.
is exact. Yeah, it's a very interesting pattern that I don't fully understand what it is about. I mean, it looks like a structural pattern that something changes structurally in people's relationship to something that has to do with the internet, like their jobs or I don't know. I don't know what it is.
Yeah, I'm personally quite fascinated by that. That's the question I've written here as to what actually happens to people.
Right, and I don't know.
It implies the internet isn't offering them something. And
I've looked at this. I ran a nonlinear maximum likelihood program that said if there's an inflection point in this data set, find the two lines.
Yeah.
Which basically said it could be anywhere or maybe nowhere, but if it's there, find it, and it'll find it around age 50.
Okay.
So I mean, it's sometimes 52, sometimes 47, but 50 It's
That's very interesting.
yeah, it is. It's very strange.
Mm.
If I could figure out a reason for it, that'd be a great paper. Um,
Yeah, you need some more surveys. That does actually lead me on to Pauline's from Digital NNS is asking, in the absence of your survey, Oxford Internet Survey 2019, is there anything similar we can look at? And is there any likelihood of the OIS survey?
the best available surveys are the Ofcom Adult Media Literacy Survey,
Yeah.
which is conducted yearly. It's a nice big sample. It's a well done professional survey. It's much more oriented toward policy issues that Ofcom cares about. So it has large numbers of questions about radio and television and things like that. It does have a set of questions, maybe 50 or so questions about the internet.
Okay.
But it doesn't have, and the problem is it doesn't have any of the questions that you need to answer any interesting theoretical question, because the theoretical questions are not what Ofcom's being paid to answer.
Yeah.
Unfortunately. It's also extremely hard to work with. They don't give it to you in a nice, clean data set.
Right.
But it's available online.
It's freely
You
available.
can look it up and download it and play with it. So.
Okay. Good. That's a good answer. She's still online, so she will have picked up on
Good.
that.
Fantastic. Okay, so we do the last question from the room.
Dr. Grant, thank you for your presentation. Do you perhaps have any advice for technology-related students, considering AI advancement and your expertise, wisdom, and data?
To say that again, with AI and...
Considering AI advancements in the last few years, would you have any advice for computer science students, for example, considering the whole data you studied, all the papers and the books?
Oh, gosh. Well, I mean, AI right now, I will say 2 or 3 things about AI. First is there's this old computer science joke that if we don't understand it, we call it AI. Once we understand it, it's just programming. Okay, so you have to keep this in perspective here, that a lot of things were called AI back in the 60s and 70s that are no longer AI. So the second thing would be, nobody really understands what's going on with neural nets and large language models at the moment. And so it's like, let's throw it up at the wall and see if it sticks. And so you see dozens and dozens, if not hundreds and hundreds of people trying all kinds of things. It's not clear which ones are going to pay off. I mean, the large language models, well, are this some sort of statistical, they're doing a statistical prediction of the next word. Okay, under what circumstances would that contribute to solving a problem? That's the difficulty right now, is it's very hard to answer that question. I have seen, here's an example. One of the examples of failure is I was at a conference where someone said, we spend a lot of time refereeing papers for journals. What if ChatGPT could referee papers for us? Okay. Well, it turns out that the correlation between the human referees and the ChatGPT scores when they did scores was 0.08. So essentially 0. And that makes a lot of sense because, the probability model here, words, doesn't really lend itself to a critique of a scholarly paper. On the other hand, one of the problems with surveys is a lot of things depend on people's jobs. And so a lot of surveys ask people for their job title. The standard OECD job title category has 436 categories in it. And it's a very expensive, time-consuming process for human coders to go through and code each text job category into one of those 436 categories. Because you've got to do it with 2 coders, they have to agree. It's a very long process. And it turns out that you can train a neural network to do that with and to give you a probability of a certainty, probability of that it's right answer. And then you still have to go through with a human being and check every single answer, but you can present the computer's answer there on the screen along with its top three rather, and it's much faster. So, you know, that's a success in a minor success, but nonetheless for certain companies, it's a lot of money. The difficulty there is, of course, you have to rejug your whole, the whole process whereby surveys are processed. And this is what's going to happen elsewhere in AI. You know, you don't just substitute a person, you don't just substitute a chatbot for a person. You have to have a, you have to change the process to make the AI piece work well in the whole stream of things that you're trying to do. And that involves corporate reorganizations, which gets into corporate politics and a whole variety of other things. And it's going to take a long time for much to happen. And it's not clear what'll happen. And the final point is, I will remind you, of course, you know, that Elon Musk in every year since 2016 to 2021 was saying that we were going to have self-driving cars in another 2 years. And what's happened there has been in the 2015-16 era, it looked like it was actually going to work. But it turns out that the last 10% of going to an autonomous vehicle is probably harder than the first 90%. No working autonomous vehicle at the moment, and there's not likely to be one in the near future. And, you know, your guess is as good as mine how many years it will be. I mean, I don't think it'll ever work in Oxford. I mean, so in fact, I have a presentation where one of my slides is from Bridge Street, which many of you will know, which it's a narrow street. It has a bicycle lane going east and no center lane, no center line. And cars, if there are two cars passing each other, the car going east has to move into the bicycle lane to give room for the other opposing car to pass it. So normally when I ride it, I can reach out and touch the car next to me, which is also illegal if you remember the rules on how far a car has to be away from a cyclist. I can't touch, I'm not supposed to be able to touch a car. That's a violation of traffic law. So what's this autonomous vehicle going to do under those circumstances? It doesn't have the right guidelines. By the way, this is a bridge, Hythe Bridge, so you don't have good sight lines. When you're approaching the bridge, you can't see opposing traffic until you're fairly close to it already, which is another problem. So you have no center line, you have curbs, but a bicycle lane on one side, it'll never work. It'll never work. I mean, an autonomous vehicle typically, I think, would in those circumstances simply stop because it couldn't legally go across that street.
So I suspect we're getting into a brand new talk on
That's a completely
merits of AI.
We're way off. We're way off the cultural effects of the internet.
Grant, thank you very much for a very entertaining evening and a very interesting talk and lots of good questions. If you didn't get a chance to ask your question, I suspect Grant wouldn't mind conversation afterwards, but we'll just give him a round of applause. Thank you very much.
Thank you.